we've established that Jesus teaches a couple of things so far in Matthew 19. That, first of all, God originally didn't intend for there to be any divorce. But secondly, he permitted divorce for a specific reason. And we have established that permitting is different than commanding. One's going to be hard-pressed to find any place in Scripture where God commands people to be divorced on a whole-scale basis. But after verse 8, we don't really hear from the Pharisees again, so evidently they were either going home to reload their weapons or, you know, they figured this isn't going to get us anywhere. We'll, you know, shrivel into the woodwork. But they may have waited long enough to hear verse 9. And definitely from what we see in verse 10, it's clear that the disciples were listening to this and they heard it. So we need to forge ahead. What else does Jesus say? Well, I would propose to you that Jesus teaches that there is a ground for divorce. And that's what Matthew 19:9 is all about, and the parallel teaching in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 5:32. And verse 9 says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, that's how the NIV translates this. The actual Greek word is porneia, and marries another woman commits adultery. Now, the bone of contention in this verse, and really in the discussion of divorce and remarriage altogether, is the meaning of that exception clause. The Greek says me epi porneia, me being the strongest form of negation that you have in the Greek language, mu, eta, and then the Greek word epsilon, pi, iota, and then porneia. We're going to have to figure out what porneia means until we've decided on what that means. I'm going to refer to that as porneia. So you'll know what I'm talking about, but we can hold off coming to a conclusion until we're ready about what porneia actually should be understood to mean. Now, if in fact the exception clause gives an exception, it's got to be an exception to something. What would it be an exception to? Well, the basic rule. And though Jesus' point is not to teach us something about ethical theory, this is helpful in understanding some things about ethics. When you lay out your moral rules, it's important for you to think about whether those rules have any exceptions or whether they don't. And if you think they have exceptions, please be sure you understand what that means. Exceptions only throw out the rule in the exceptional cases. They don't throw out the rule in every case. Sometimes people see an exception to a rule and they think that nullifies the rule. Always, no. Exceptions to rules only nullify the rules in the exceptional cases. In the non-exceptional cases, the rule stands. So, in verse 9, we've got a rule and we've got an exception. And we need to both understand the rule and understand the exception. The rule is, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. The exception to that rule is except for porneia. So, evidently, Jesus is saying that if you divorce your wife and you marry another, you commit adultery. Well, that's the rule. But what does it mean? Why would that be so? Well, there's something that I need to explain and make sure that we're clear about, because we're going to be able to use it in the rest of the discussion. At least we'd better use it in the rest of the discussion, or we're not going to be able to make sense out of what we're talking about. Now, Jesus says that if you divorce and you remarry, you commit adultery. And again, let's remind ourselves, what is adultery? Adultery is being married to one person and having sex relations with someone you're not married to. Okay. So what do you think then is the logic of this? When you get married to someone, in God's eyes, that establishes a marital bond between that husband and that wife. I think that's what you'd find it means back in Genesis 2, when God institutes marriage. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. That's the forming of that marital bond. Now, what is crucial then in this discussion is to always ask yourself, at any point in the midst of the story, what is the status of that marital bond? In God's eyes, not in the eyes of the state. We know that for all sorts of reasons, you can break the marital bond legally. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how God looks at it. That's why we're studying this topic from the perspective of God's Word, not from the perspective of American law or any other nation's law. So, okay, adultery is having sex relations with one woman when you're married, for those of us who are men, when you're married to another. So once you've established a marital bond with a woman, you're supposed to be faithful to that bond, and one of the ways you're supposed to be faithful to that is you're not supposed to have sex relations with anyone but that woman with whom you have that bond. And so now I think we're ready to understand the rule. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. How could that be so? If you divorce your wife and it breaks the marital bond between you and her in God's eyes, why would getting married to another woman be adultery? If adultery is having sex with one person while you're still married to another. So then Jesus can't mean that if you divorce your wife and in my eyes that marital bond is dissolved, and then you go out and constitute another marital bond with a second wife, you've committed adultery, because you're still not having more than one marital bond in God's eyes at any time. So then, what must the rule mean, and how does it work? It must be that what Jesus is saying is that if you divorce your wife, but not because of anything that would break that marital bond with her in God's eyes, and then you marry someone else, you've committed adultery. Now I understand why I commit adultery, because in God's eyes I'm still married to one woman and I'm having sex relations with another. Oh, then I'd better be sure, if I take a wife a second time, that the first marriage is really over in God's eyes. Okay, that is the basic rule, and that's what it means. Now the next question is, what does the exception clause mean, and what does it do to the rule? Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if what the exception clause means was very easy to discern, and that everybody agreed, every evangelical agreed? You know better than that. Many years ago when I pastored, I figured I'd better figure this out. And so I did some study on it and prepared a sermon series. And at that point, the amount of study I'd done, I thought, well, okay, there's maybe 2 or 3 possible understandings of the exception clause. And then I started to teach ethics and did some more study and then prepared to write the chapter. And wow, you know what I found? There's not 2 or 3 or even 4 potential understandings. There's about 12 or 13. And that's if you think Jesus actually said this and Matthew actually wrote Matthew. If you don't think those things, then multiply those 12 or 13 things by 2 or 3. Is it any clearer why maybe the church can't agree on divorce and remarriage? Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't discuss it and that it's impossible to understand it, but this is why you need to study it and you need to explain these things to your congregation and explain the basis of your position and of your church's position. Well, so what are the options? What I'd like to do in the time that remains, it may go a few minutes over, is to run through the different possibilities. I'm not going to evaluate them right now. We'll do that tomorrow morning, Lord willing. But I want to at least present what they are and explain them. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to present each understanding of the exception clause, and I'm going to have on the slides a rewriting of Matthew 19:9 as it would read if you adopt this particular understanding. Okay, so here we go. We can divide the different views of the meaning of the exception clause into 3 broad categories. The first broad category is no divorce positions. The second broad category, we'll get to this in a bit, so don't worry about this now, but just to say, so you know where I'm going, are positions that say there is divorce but no remarriage. And then there's going to be a group of positions that says there's both divorce and remarriage that's allowed. So, first of all, let's look at the positions that say, contrary to what you would normally think, with an exception to a general rule, there actually aren't any circumstances under which we could divorce or remarry. First of all, there's the inclusivist view, and you understand that these are different interpretations of that little phrase, me epi porneia. Now, this view says that Jesus is not actually excluding a certain situation from the basic rule. He's making a special point to give the general rule and make sure that you know the general rule includes this. Okay, so how do we read this? Well, if we read the verse this way, it would say, whoever divorces his wife for any reason, even including porneia, and remarries, commits adultery. Well, if you read the verse that way, are there going to be any grounds, legitimate grounds for divorce from God's perspective? No. Read this way, the verse says, you can't divorce your wife and marry someone else without committing adultery. You know, even in the case where the divorce was done on the grounds of porneia, you still are not allowed to do that, because even in that case, remarriage would commit adultery. So what's the message? You better not divorce regardless of what the grounds are. Second, the preteritive or the no comment view says that actually what the exception clause is doing there is that Jesus has avoided commenting on the intramural debate within Judaism up through verse 8. We've seen how he's done that. And now Jesus is going to give his rule, but he is consistent with his desire not to comment on the Pharisees' debate, and so that's the point of the exception clause. I haven't commented on your debate yet, and I'm not going to now. If you read the verse that way, it would say, if anyone divorces his wife, except in the case of porneia, about which I shall make no comment, and remarries, he commits adultery. If you read the exception clause that way, does that allow you a ground for divorce? If I divorce my wife and remarry another, I commit adultery, and we know under the Mosaic law that adulterers are supposed to be stoned to death, so I guess I better not do it. Jesus is warning me, and anyone else who considers this, not to do it. And the exception clause doesn't say, well, now here's one case where you could divorce and remarry without committing adultery. Jesus is singling out porneia to tell you, I won't comment on this. Now, one thing that goes with this view is, you might say, well, why would Jesus single that out to make this comment? It's because this view comes with the belief that porneia is the Greek equivalent to ervat davar. So that Jesus is not only not going to comment on the debate the Pharisees raise in verse 3, he's making an explicit point to say, I'm not going to get involved in your debate. So one of the things that we have to decide on is whether porneia is equivalent to ervat davar. And of course you can't do that before you know what ervat davar refers to and what porneia refers to. Okay, so you can see some of the assignments we've got to address tomorrow morning. All right, third view. This one is really sort of unusual, and it actually only can apply to the exception clause as you find it in Matthew 5. And if you're familiar with the way that's stated, you know that while it looks like it's giving the same rule, it doesn't say exactly the same thing. So we're going to have to explain at some point what this verse means. Verse 31 of Matthew 5, Jesus says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, verse 32, that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness, except for porneia, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a woman so divorced commits adultery. Now, this view only makes sense if you deal with the statement of things in Matthew 5. And according to this point, or this view, the point of the exception clause is for Jesus to clarify what it is that's happened in the sequence of events that makes her an adulteress. Okay? So you would read it this way, and I can read it and explain to you why this is clarification of the offense. Everyone who divorces his wife, except for porneia, makes her commit adultery, makes her an adulteress. In the case of porneia, you're divorcing her isn't going to make her an adulteress because you're divorcing her for porneia, for adultery. So she's already an adulteress. You can't make her an adulteress by divorcing her, because the reason you're divorcing her is that she already committed adultery. So you can't make her an adulteress the second time over. So what's the point of the exception clause? It's to clarify exactly what the offense is that caused the divorce. If the divorce was not for porneia, which typically is understood as adultery here, then you're divorcing her, and her remarriage, that's when she commits adultery. But the cause of the divorce wasn't that she committed adultery. The adultery only happened when she got remarried. The exception says, well, that's the way it works, except when the reason you divorced her is she committed adultery. That's what the offense was. And when she remarried, that's not when she started committing adultery, because she was already an adulteress. That's why you divorced her. And someone who's an adulteress already, you're not going to make them one afresh. So what does the exception clause do in this case? Well, without the exception clause, it's the remarriage that makes her commit adultery. With the exception clause, before the divorce occurred, she committed adultery. So now that you know this understanding of the exception clause, you can sit there with the scorecard and you can say, okay, this happened. No, not adultery yet. Okay, now this happened. Now there's the offense. Or with the exception clause, no, it happened earlier. Okay, that's the exception or clarification of the offense. Would this understanding allow anybody to divorce their wife and remarry? No. On this view, what it does is tells you what the offense is and when it gets committed. But that doesn't say anybody can get divorced and remarried. That's why this is one of the no divorce positions. Fourth position, a little bit easier to understand. This is the unchastity in the betrothal period view. You remember in Jewish wedding customs, Jewish wedding ceremonies had 3 stages. There was first the contracting of the marriage. That could happen even when the parties were kids. And they didn't live together, of course, because they were children. And then there was the great day when they were old enough to actually begin to live together as man and wife. And so the bridegroom would come to the home of the bride, collect the bride, bring her to his house, and the final stage was the wedding feast, the marriage supper. That's the imagery, by the way, behind Matthew 19, 1 through 10, marriage supper of the Lamb. Well, okay, the marriage is contracted when the 2 people are kids, and then they have to wait until they grow up. Well, what happens if between the time the marriage is contracted and the time when they're supposed to start living together, um, the girl engages in some hanky-panky. Technical Greek term, no. Uh, what happens then? Under the Mosaic law, you were allowed to divorce her. Class, that's exactly the issue that confronted Joseph in regard to Mary when she was found to be pregnant with Jesus. So, that must be what Jesus is talking about. Whoever divorces his wife for any reason except the reason of her unfaithfulness during the betrothal period and remarries commits adultery. But now, the focus of position number 4 and 5 and 6 also emphasizes that it's only in Matthew's gospel that you have the exception clause. And Matthew is specifically written to Jews to convince them that Jesus is their Messiah. So whatever the exception clause is, it must have something to do with Jewish stuff. Well, this is part of the Jewish law, so that's what Jesus is talking about. Does the Jewish law apply to us today? Well, in terms of engagement periods, no. I think even the staunchest continuity proponent in regard to the law of Moses wouldn't say that applies. So then, would this view give anybody today the opportunity, the right to divorce anyone? No. That's why it's a no divorce position. 5, mixed marriage view. You remember back in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the people returned from Babylonian captivity, and the Lord was utterly appalled because while they'd been in Babylonian captivity, a lot of them had married Babylonian wives. And in that one unusual circumstance, God not only allowed the Jews to divorce their Gentile wives, he commanded them to do so. The point of it was to ensure the both ethnic but spiritual purity of the nation. Well, there are folk who would say that's the incident that the exception clause refers to. If you go that direction, you read it, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except the reason that she's an unbelieving pagan and remarries commits adultery. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can take this. The way it usually is taken is this refers to something back in past Jewish history, so it doesn't even refer to Israel today, let alone to the rest of us, so this is a no divorce position. Sometimes this can be used as saying, well, Jesus maybe is applying this to people in his day where they were both unbelievers and one member of the family, the husband or the wife, accepted Christ and the other didn't. And to ensure the purity of the fledgling church, Jesus says you can divorce your spouse if she or if he is a non-believer. But that would only relate to early church history. That doesn't give any of us a right to divorce. Okay, number 6. Some people say, no, the exception clause is about the violation of the laws of consanguinity, which is a fancy way of saying incest. Goes back to Leviticus. That's what Jesus is saying. That you can't divorce and remarry unless you find out that the person who you married is such a close blood relative that having sex relations with her is actually committing incest. Mosaic law allowed you to get rid of your wife. So that's something Jewish. But that was in that day. That doesn't apply to us. So still, this gives no grounds today for divorce. Whoever divorces his wife for any reason except to avoid committing incest and remarries commits adultery. There is, I think you will be thankful, only one divorce but no remarriage view. Heth and Wenham, in their publication, Jesus and Divorce, from a number of years ago espouse this, but as they show, this seems to have been the position of the early church fathers. What does it say? Well, the way that you should read Matthew 19:9 is as follows. Divorce is acceptable only in cases where porneia has been committed. So there is an exception to the no divorce rule. When porneia was committed, you can divorce, but that doesn't allow you to remarry. So this understands that divorce plus remarriage equals adultery. That's in general. Divorce where porneia has been committed, that's not adultery, so you can divorce if your spouse committed porneia, but even so, you're not allowed to marry anybody else. You see, this view says that what constitutes adultery is not just divorce, but it's divorce and remarriage. So you're never going to be allowed to remarry on this view, but in cases where the ground for the divorce was that the spouse committed porneia, okay, you could at least divorce, but you couldn't remarry. So what are the options? Well, either remain single or reconcile with your wife. And incidentally, one of the reasons that this was commonly held in the early church is that the thought was, if you do this, that will be a punishment to the unfaithful spouse, and perhaps she will come to her senses and, rather than living alone in Greco-Roman culture where a woman didn't have many rights, she would repent and she'd come back and reconstitute the marriage with her first husband. That was the hope. So if that's what you hope, you're not going to allow the divorced person to remarry. That is, remarry someone other than her first husband. Then there are the divorce and remarriage views, which suggest that biblically God will allow you in some cases to divorce, and in cases where it's acceptable to divorce, you're also allowed to marry again. And yet there are versions of this. The main view is this view, divorce and remarriage view, is typically referred to in literature as the Erasmian view. That refers to Erasmus of Rotterdam, who popularized this, held it. Well, all right, so here are the options for the Erasmian view. One view says the exception clause grants a genuine exception to the no divorce rule. So when the exception applies, you can divorce, and if you can divorce, you can remarry. And it says porneia is to be understood as meaning adultery. A second variation of this says the exception clause grants a genuine exception to the no divorce rule, but rather than saying porneia means adultery, porneia is a more general term denoting various sexual improprieties, not just porneia, but homosexuality, lesbianism, bestiality, things like that. So this would allow you to divorce on such grounds, and if you're allowed to divorce, you could remarry. And then as a final variation, we have to bring in tomorrow 1 Corinthians 7, which is referred to as the Pauline privilege. So the basic ground for divorce is porneia, but then there's a second ground that gets added in 1 Corinthians 7. So the result of that is that when you put Jesus' teaching and Paul's teaching together, you have two grounds for divorce. And if it's okay to divorce in God's eyes, it's okay to remarry.